All right, hello everyone. Hope we're coming good enough. So this week is the last week of the month of February. This year's already kind of going along. We're already through 2 months already. So as I said with our last video that we had done, I believe it was Saturday that we did it. For of course, since it's the end of the month, we're going to go ahead and get the presidential video done for the month. Next month I should have more videos out next month. This month I recognize I only had 3 because I took a week break at the first of the week of the month, and then just had an idea for the other 2 and then kinda ran out of time. Plus February is a shorter month than most. And next month we should have a couple more videos planned. I have a couple of definitely some topics I do want to hit that I come across recently that we'll look into going into. So for this month's president, last month we covered Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge comes into office in 1923. He comes into office in 1923 upon the death of President Harding. He had been Harding's vice president since 21, and Coolidge is president until 29. He oversees economic prosperity during the 1920s, but at the same time, the conditions of the United States economy are not getting any better in terms of the cracks that are starting to show and will rapidly become a major issue going forward. So the president for this month is perhaps president that is not really kindly looked upon as a very good president, and that's even by modern day standards. And that would be Mr. Herbert Hoover. Mr. Herbert Hoover is not usually seen as one of our best presidents because of what hits during his one term. I think we know what that would be: the Great Depression. And Hoover is not the best at trying to manage that crisis. Even after looking deeply into his record, I can't really give much credit. So, with these videos, for anyone that is new to them, we always go through a little bit of a biography with these guys. Now, with Hoover, I was actually surprised at how much I was able to compile on him. I considered, since the fact that he's a one term president and wasn't really that good in his job, that we wouldn't have as nearly a long video on him, say, next month's presidential video. That will be FDR, who is going to be a much longer video than most presidents because he's the only president to get literally 4 terms. So we got 12 years of a presidency to cover with that one. That one might be a bit. But with Hoover, I didn't think it'd be as long, but I was surprised at how much I was able to compile on him to kind of fill in this man that is so derogatory in terms of political language, of even current President Donald Trump at one point saying last year during the election that he doesn't want to be, one of his biggest fears is being a Herbert Hoover. Yeah, there's a good reason that he said that. Even by modern day standards, Herbert Hoover is not looked upon as a good president. So, for those of you who are not aware, we go through a little biography of them. We go through their early life, we go through their early political career, and then we hit presidency. And then, if there's any of a after, some presidents, of course, die in office or are assassinated, we go into a little bit of what happens after they leave office, which in most cases isn't much. So, for Herbert Hoover, he was born Herbert Clark Hoover on August 10th of 1874 in West Branch, Iowa. He was the first U.S. president that we have had that was actually born west of the Mississippi River. Prior to Herbert Hoover, every American president had been born in a state east of the Mississippi. So this is a change. He was also born into a family of devout Quakers. And if Quakers are, of course, a religious sect that really are pacifist by nature, if anyone is not familiar with what a Quaker is. And because of his Quaker upbringing, Hoover's family instilled Quaker values such as honesty, industriousness, and simplicity. The Quaker way of life was what was instilled in Hoover very early on, and that would impact his view going into his political career down the road. His father, Jesse, was a blacksmith, and his mother, Huldah, was a teacher. Now, in 1884, Hoover becomes an orphan along with his other siblings as his father ends up dying in 1880, and then in 1884, his mother ends up dying. Hoover is only 9 years old at the time of his mother's death, so he's only 9 years old and becomes an orphan. And him and his siblings are then sent off from Iowa to go live with a uncle that lives out in Oregon. So he is very much raised in the West, much unlike other presidents. In 1891, Hoover would become one of the first students to enter Stanford University. He would graduate in 1895 with a degree in geology. Hoover became very enamored with the mining business and with minerals, and this is what he decided to pursue in college. And immediately upon graduating from Stanford University, he begins to pursue a career in mining, which is where he will make his money. Hoover's mining career would make him a highly successful businessman. He would travel the world in order to find new mineral deposits and to establish business enterprises for his fledgling company. And Hoover, when I say he traveled the world, I mean he went global worldwide. He went to South Africa, he went to China, he went to Australia. We actually have a photo of him in Australia from 1898. During his time as a mining man, he on February 10th of 1899, Hoover would end up marrying Lou Henry, who was a former college sweetheart that he once again came in contact with and ended up marrying her. They would have end up having two sons together. They would have Herbert and Allen. And before we go here, I guess I'll show the first two images that we have to go along with Hoover. So this is the earliest picture that we have of Hoover that I could find from 1877. So he would have been what here? He would have been like 3 years old, three, maybe four, 3 or 4 years old at the time of this photo. It's the earliest picture that we could find of the man as a young boy. And then let me see here. We got I said that we had a picture. Yes, right here it is. This is a picture of him in 1898 in his 20s. And this is during his time as a mining man. But this is a picture that was taken of him in West Perth, Australia during one of his global business trips that he went on during his mining career. I think he would have been about, trying to think, would he be here? 24, maybe? 24, 23. Hoover, now when Hoover was a mining man at heart, but when Hoover doesn't really enter the political side of things until the outbreak of the First World War. The outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914 ends up bringing Hoover to a much wider acclaim because he becomes very enamored with humanitarian work. He, at this point, has quite a bit of money hauled up from his mining career, and he, because of his, I'm guessing, because of his Quaker values that were instilled in him as a child, going into Quaker schools and being raised in a Quaker family, I'm guessing this also impacted the way that he wanted to treat others. And during the First World War, Hoover was very, very involved with humanitarian causes in Europe. And this is what would end up bringing him into a political career. During the First World War, he would end up helping over 120,000 Americans end up getting back home that had been on vacation in Europe when the war broke out. Now Europe is engulfed in war, and these American citizens now want to go home. They don't want to be caught up in a war. And in some cases they're ending up being stranded because a lot of the British shipping lines and French shipping lines and German shipping lines are now becoming those ships are now becoming targets of war, and those ships are also being requisitioned for the war effort. So a lot of Americans are stranded in Europe because, mind you, planes aren't really commercial air travel is not a thing yet in the 1910s. So Hoover, along with several other philanthropic businessmen, ended up going on these great humanitarian drives to try to get these tourists home. And by the end of the World War I, he had managed to help over 120,000 of them get home from war-ravaged Europe. Hoover would also help to coordinate the delivery of food and supplies to occupied areas of Europe, such as Belgium after Germany had invaded, and parts of northern France that were being ravaged by the war effort. And thus, he wanted to help them get fresh food, clothing, supplies, whatever they needed in order to continue their daily lives. Hoover would become much more involved in the war after 1917 when the United States officially actually would enter World War I. This is when he would become much more directly involved. The Wilson administration, under President Woodrow Wilson, would actually appoint Hoover as the head of the new Food Administration. And what the Food Administration's job was to basically encourage Americans at home to cut back on the consumption of needed foods and commodities, such as meat, and buying new clothes and stuff like that, and producing enough so that they could basically so that surpluses could go to the frontline troops in Europe. So basically telling Americans, cut back on your food consumption, cut back on your production, on your consumption of meat, cut back on your consumption of, commodities like clothing and stuff as much as possible so that we can send those to our boys over in Europe that need it. and Hoover was the head of that administration during the war. He would continue his humanitarian work even after the war's end in 1918 as head of the American Relief Administration, in which he would arrange shipments of food and aid to go to war-ravaged nations in Europe. Because, mind you, the United States really got off light in World War One. We come in with like the last year of the conflict. We're never directly invaded, so we have a couple 100,000 casualties, I believe, but nothing like these nations in Europe that have been fighting for 4 years in the trenches and artillery and bombardments. Whole villages wiped out in France and Belgium and Germany. In no, I wouldn't say Germany because Germany wasn't invaded till the end. But just the devastation in Europe is appalling, and the United States really comes off as the only nation after World War One that's in any kind of an good economic position because the other countries are massively in debt from their war efforts, where the United States kind of comes in at the last minute. And in large part, before they had gotten involved, had actually been the person that was getting money from these European countries in order to send arms and munitions to them. But after the war, Hoover is the head of this relief administration that goes to try to help out these war ravaged countries and get them back up to snuff. And even Germany ends up getting American aid to try to rebuild, which led to many grateful Europeans across many countries writing letters of appreciation to Hoover for what they called Hoover lunches, for being able to try to get them back on their feet, I should say. Sorry. So Hoover's success as a humanitarian, as a humanitarian leader during the First World War would end up granting him a spot on President Harding's cabinet in 1921. In 1921, when Harding takes office, he taps Hoover to be his new Secretary of Commerce in his new cabinet. And this would be a post that he would continue to hold under Coolidge, as Hoover managed to avoid becoming embroiled in the Teapot Dome scandal in 1923 that brought down a lot of the other cabinet members of Harding's cabinet. And because he was not embroiled in that, Coolidge was pretty much able to keep him. Now, is that to say that him and Coolidge got along in all things? Not really. Later, I believe in 1928, when Hoover ended up running for the presidency, Coolidge was kind of reluctant to support Hoover because he had said something of the manner that Hoover has given him unequivocal advice during his presidency, all of it bad, and he just didn't want to go against the party, and that's why he ended up supporting Hoover in the 1920 election, even though he personally didn't have a kind fondness for Hoover in any means. But Hoover will serve as Secretary of Commerce in both the Harding and Coolidge administrations. And while in that position, he would also start to support efforts to organize the radio and aviation industries that are starting to burgeon in the United States in order to further commerce. So let's see here. I think we got a couple images here. So here's a picture of Hoover from 1925. This is during his time as Secretary of Commerce. Well, we'll show this one first. So this is 1921. This is right the year that he becomes Secretary of Commerce. This is him at a baseball game with President Harding and his wife, First Lady Florence Harding. So this is Hoover right here at the baseball game with the president and his wife, the very year that he ends up getting appointed. And then here, this would have been taken by the time of the Coolidge administration, because at this point Harding had died. This is him at a radio station, which he was involved with trying to get the radio and aviation industries, trying to increase their proficiency in the country during that time. So that picture would have been 100 years ago. Now, Hoover would entertain the idea throughout the 1920s of a possible presidential bid at some point during the 1920s. His humanitarian work in Europe and across the country had made him almost like a celebrity in politics, and thus him getting into the Secretary of Commerce position that also springboarded him to a possible presidential run. And Hoover was considering it throughout the 1920s. However, he was very careful to announce when he would decide to run because he did not want to alienate President Coolidge. He thought Coolidge was doing a good enough job. He didn't want to run against Coolidge. So he's like, I better watch what I say and pick the right moment because Coolidge may want another term, because Coolidge was entirely within his rights to run again in 1928 if he so chose. And there was a common belief among many Republicans in leading up to that that they thought Coolidge would run for another term, only to be shocked in 1927 when Coolidge absolutely said that, "Nope, I have no intentions of running for another term in 1928. So come the end of this term in March of 1929, I'm out. I'm done." And that shocked a lot of Republicans, including Hoover. Hoover, who had definitely expected that Coolidge would run. With Coolidge out of the picture for the 1928 election, Hoover becomes one of the prominent front runners for the Republican nomination that year. And he would end up securing the Republican nomination after only the first ballot. On the very first ballot, Hoover ends up getting nominated for the Republican and winning that nomination at the Republican Party convention. Now, what would happen significantly is they would change the unfortunately, they would end up changing the VP. The VP was changed during Hoover's term, and that would have been Charles Dawes had only been nominated to run with Coolidge back in 1924, and there was the expectation that Dawes would be nominated to be VP again by the convention because back then president the presidential candidate did not pick their running mate. The party generally did. And Dawes ends up getting dropped from the 1928 Republican ticket because Hoover has very dislike of Dawes. He doesn't care for Dawes. He doesn't want him to be his running mate at all. And they end up going with Native American Kansas Senator Charles Curtis instead to try to appease Hoover's desire to not have Dawes on the ticket. Hoover's opponent was Democratic New York Governor Al Smith. Smith was actually he was the first Catholic candidate to come from a major party in a presidential election, which of course we know that the United States has only ended up having two Catholic presidents. We've had John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, and then just recently we had Joe Biden, who was also Catholic. I shouldn't say also was also because he is. He's still alive. Hoover, during the 1928 campaign, would center his whole campaigning message on the Republican record of peace and prosperity throughout the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, as it was called, and his reputation as a successful engineer and public official. He would avoid political speeches. However, his VP, Charles Curtis, would not be so kind as to avoid political speeches, and him and the other Republican Party officials would largely do that work for him. Now, Hoover, one of the more controversial things that comes up during the 1928 election is the Republican Party is striving to gain some votes in the normally Democratic South, and that is something that they want to try to do in 1928. Coolidge had been able to do it in 1924 and 1920 with Harding, and this was something the Republicans really wanted to continue growing on. And so there comes the strategy of, well, what if try to appease white Southerners in the South? What if we try to eliminate black Republicans from certain leadership positions within the party? That might go a long way to try to appease some of these white Southerners who might be turned off by an African American politician in a sort of leadership position within the party. And Hoover does end up endorsing this campaign strategy. Very sadly, he does end up endorsing it, but so did most of the Republican Party at the time in order to gain votes. And it does seem to work in the 1920 election because Hoover does manage to win a couple of southern states. And that strategy very likely did have an impact on the election outcome in that those states alone, that they're not exiling black Republicans from the party, but they're pretty much removing them from any position of leadership within the party in order to gain those votes in a very sad political moment. So the 1928 election results were as follows. You needed 266 electoral votes in order to gain the majority of the 531 in order to win. Hoover would take 444 of those electoral votes. It was a landslide victory, again, for Republicans, with Smith only gaining 87. The popular vote was also decisively in Hoover's favor, with him winning over 58.1%. Almost 60% of the popular vote went to Hoover, with his opponent, Democratic Governor Al Smith, only winning 40.9%. And Hoover took 40 of the 48 states at the time, while Smith only got 8. So, and here is the electoral map from that time. And like I said, I think that campaign strategy of eliminating black Republicans from leadership positions definitely did actually accomplish what they had hoped it would do. It's sad that they resorted to that, but it did work because the normally Democratic South, mostly the former Confederate states, I mean, Hoover ends up taking Texas, he ends up taking Florida, he ends up taking Virginia, and he ends up taking North Carolina and even Tennessee. Only these bulk of the deep South states really resisted Hoover, along with Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Those were the only states to actually oppose it. But a landslide victory, no doubt accomplished because of Hoover running on the promise of, the Republican track record of success in the economy during the 1920s. There's been genuine peace. There's not been any major issues. Republicans are running strong in the 1920s, and that helps them in the election. But the irony of it all being, Hoover comes into office expecting to run on the same economic prosperity that has brought him into office. That has been the case since Harding, through Coolidge, and Hoover comes in office expecting, this is going to be under my presidency. We'll continue this trend. This is not going to change. Only to be hit with a bombshell in October of the year that he ends up taking office. That ends up blasting any chance he has of even retaining it 4 years later. So Hoover ends up being inaugurated on March 4th of 1929. He viewed the presidency as a vehicle for improving the conditions for all Americans through private public cooperation. On the campaign trail, he had even promised that I will simply continue the policies of the Harding and Coolidge administrations. I have no intention of breaking away from those policies that have worked so far. But most most importantly, the one thing that is really going to sink Hoover during the Great Depression that's coming up is his opposition to government intervention. And we'll go into why, and you'll see why as we go into this. But this is the one thing that I think is what's, to put it bluntly, messed, to, yeah, to put it bluntly, screwed him over. Because Hoover could have done the Great Depression, by any means, it wasn't a death sentence for Hoover's presidency. Had he reacted the way that he should have, he could have, come out of it just fine. And America could have the recovery could have been a lot shorter. But because of Hoover's inactivity due to his opposition to government intervention, this is part of the reason why the Depression gets so bad in the early 30s, and part of the reason why it takes so long to get out of it. Not to say that Hoover's the only person responsible. I mean, I can't really blame Hoover for the conditions that lead to the Depression because he had just come into office the year it ends up breaking out. But I can attribute a good part of the blame as to why it ends up lasting so long and to why it got so bad as it did. Now, the first major bill that Hoover would end up signing during his new presidency was the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929. And this act established the Federal Farm Board in order to stabilize farm prices that had been in fluctuation throughout the 1920s. Now, as you may recall, when we did Calvin Coolidge, that was actually one of the biggest political battles during Coolidge's presidency. Was this what do we do with farm prices? There are multiple bills that come up in Congress during Coolidge's presidency to try to set some kind of a regulatory thing on farm prices, and for the government to get involved. And Coolidge adamantly opposes it each time it goes through. With none of those bills end up getting actually passed. With Coolidge, one did get passed only for Coolidge to veto it and then it not get enough votes to undo his veto. And Hoover, right away, upon taking office in 1929, ends up rapidly doing a 180 from Coolidge's position and signs this act into law to help farmers. Hoover very famously would state his belief before the stock market crashed in 1929. This was the quote that he had given was given the chance to go forward with policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon with the help of God be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. How ironic that he would state that and then his presidency end up being the absolute disaster that it was. It was Hoover's belief that America was economically secure. The past 8 years had been a booming economy. There was no reason for him to really massively believe that we were on any sort of major economic crisis. And a majority of many Americans believe the same thing. They didn't believe that we had any kind of major economic crisis on the horizon. They thought, yeah, anyone that's suggesting that's crazy. Only the experts really saw the dangers that were starting to appear in the US economy. And contrary to popular belief in the 1920s, the US economy is starting to show some major cracks that are not getting addressed. And the experts are already starting to sound the alarm bell saying, if you do not fix this, we are going to have one possibly the biggest economic crisis this country has ever faced. And they end up being right. Some of the problems that were already present in the American economy in the late 1920s by 1929 are problems that have kind of been there throughout the 1920s, but because of government inaction and because of them getting worse, it's starting to actually get to the point that it's going to have an effect. Some of these problems have been such as the persistent farm crisis, with farm prices and with farmers going under, which Hoover does try to address as soon as he comes into office. So I can't say that he didn't try there. But there's also a saturation of consumer goods. Americans are buying more commodities for themselves than ever, and they're buying on credit. They're not always having the cash to buy these goods, and credit is a relatively popular way to buy things in the 1920s that, oh, I'll use a I don't even think it was credit cards, but it was just credit where you could buy on money that you would end up having to pay back. And a lot of Americans go for this for big purchases, and this is not a good thing, not in the large amounts that they were doing it. Not to say that credit in general cannot be helpful, but to do it in the degree that Americans were buying on credit in the 1920s, long term, this is not a good thing that you're buying everything on someone else's money, on loans and stuff like that. There was also drastic income inequality that is starting to take shape in the United States. And mind you, to this day, there's still income inequality, which is always, I think, going to be a crack in the American economy. And possibly the one thing that did more than anything to sink with the US economy in 1929 was the excessive speculation on stocks. The stock market was all the rage in the 1920s, and Americans, even almost every American that had any sort of good amount of money that they could put, was into buying stocks. And they would speculate on these stocks. They would buy them. Basically, the speculation on stocks would raise their prices far above what the stock was actually worth. They would buy them and then rapidly try to resell them at a much higher price than the stock was actually worth because they thought, "Oh yeah, this is going to go up. This is a good buy right now. It's going to skyrocket after I buy it and then I can try to resell it for a much higher price." That doesn't end up happening, but they try to do it anyway. And this excessive speculation on the stocks is going to be the one thing that ends up causing the smoking gun that will light the Great Depression off. Now, Coolidge and Hoover both have been warned by economic experts and business leaders that a failure to curb the stock market speculation would eventually lead to a massive economic catastrophe. They were both warned of this. Coolidge was warned of it multiple times during his presidency, and Hoover, upon getting into office, is warned of the same warning by these experts saying that you've got to do something about this because if you don't, it is going to end up blowing up in our face. This bubble, it will burst. And neither Coolidge nor Hoover really want to mess because of their staunch conservative, no federal intervention stances. They don't want to get involved with the U.S. economy. They want kind of that laissez-faire, hands-off approach. They don't want the Federal Reserve, which is controlling the American bank system, to really get involved with it. And so they're like, nah, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, like you guys are worrying too much. I mean, have you seen the economy? It's doing good. Why on earth would it burst and cause something bad like that? To be fair, they were warned and did nothing. But in Hoover's case, the only defense I can give Hoover in that case is the factor that Hoover is only in office since March and it burst in October. So he doesn't have a whole lot of time. That is the only defense I can give Hoover in that situation. Now, that massive bubble that's been building on the speculation of stocks, just like the experts have said, it does eventually burst, and it bursts in October of 1929. Hoover's not even been in office for a year. In October of 1929, we had what is called Black Tuesday. Black, I think there was a Black Thursday before that. Black Thursday, I think about 12 million shares ended up getting traded because of the rapidly depreciating value. But Black Tuesday on October 29th saw over 16 million stock shares traded in a single day because everyone started that speculation bubble where people had overinflated the stock prices. It finally burst. People realized they had nothing. They had absolutely nothing. They had wasted their money on these stocks, and in trying to sell them back, massive losses on the stock board. And this would be the official start of the Great Depression. There were stock people who left the stock market on Black Tuesday who had lost everything, lost every penny they ever had. And there were some that were so bad off, they ended up committing suicide because they honestly they knew they had done it. They were bankrupt, they didn't have a penny to their name, and they didn't think life was worth even continuing at that point, which is unfortunate to say. It's unfortunate to say that they committed suicide, but that was their mindset, but they had lost everything, and thus there was no point in going on. Hoover, at first, very surprisingly, tried to say, "This ain't as bad as it looks." He tried to actually paint the stock market crash as a good sign, which was blatantly, living in fairy tale land that he was even trying to propose this. He would end up gathering very shortly after the stock market crash. Hoover would gather business and labor leaders together for a meeting to try to convey his concerns to them and what he thought they should be doing. So he expressed his belief with these business and labor leaders across the country and also railroad leaders that it would only be a small recession, like what happened 10 years prior in 1920. We had a small recession then. We're going to have a small recession now. This is not going to be a major, depression or anything. You guys should not have to worry massively. And because of his belief that it would only be a small economic recession like the country had had after World War I, he asked them to avoid wage cuts and work stoppages. He also asked and convinced the railroads and utilities to increase their spending on construction and maintenance. Basically, he's saying, don't worry about the economy. This is not going to be no big deal. It's just a small recession. It'll really help the economy if you guys continue to work as normal, don't lay off your workers, don't do wage cuts, continue to invest in maintenance of your facilities, continue to invest in construction. If we can do that, we'll come out of this real quick. That is not what ends up happening at all. At that same meeting, Hoover would also authorize the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. Unfortunately for Hoover, he's sitting there telling these business leaders and these labor leaders and these railroad executives, "Oh, yeah, don't worry about it, just continue to." The economic reality was so far removed from what Hoover thought it was. That is not what ends up happening at all. These companies, in order to survive, were forced to do wage cuts. They were forced to do layoffs. They had no choice in order to continue to even operate. In 1930, Hoover would acquire another $100 million from Congress in order to put toward the Federal Farm Board in order to act as a stimulus for American farmers. However, when he was questioned of whether or not he would grant federal aid for the unemployed that were starting to rapidly rise in the country, he absolutely refused that any federal aid would go to the unemployed, as he believed that these were the job programs and responsibility of state and local governments and that of philanthropic organizations. He did not believe it was the federal government's place to provide any kind of a welfare system, any kind of a bailout to its citizens, even if they were unemployed and literally had lost everything. Hoover did not believe that was the federal government's responsibility. In June of 1930, and this is going to correlate to today because I mean, right now, one of the biggest economic questions is President Trump's upcoming tariffs that are set as of right now to go into effect next Tuesday, March 4th. And most economic experts are agreeing that they're going to be an absolute disaster. And in my personal opinion, looking at the historic record of how well tariffs have worked, I'm kind of in agreement. I'm not saying I couldn't be surprised. I mean, maybe this will be a 180 from what I expect, and I hope for our sakes it is. But just looking at the historical record, tariffs are not a good thing. And this is an example of that. In June of 1930, during the midst of an economic crisis, the Great Depression, mind you, Trump's doing this right now because, the United States is kind of in an economic crisis right now. Our economy is not the best. But in June of 1930, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. And what this tariff did was originally Hoover only wanted tariffs raised on agricultural products in order to help out American farmers. However, Congress was not willing to do a separate bill on it and already had another bill in place that was going to raise tariffs on a broad array of products coming into the United States. And they simply said to Hoover, well, we'll be willing to combine that with the agricultural tariffs in this bill. And Hoover ended up going along with it. It would raise tariff rates on over 20,000 imported goods, including agricultural products, with the means with the desired effect of trying to boost, the profits and the economy here in the United States by encouraging, American consumers to buy at home. Unfortunately, it ends up making the depression even worse, which is why I'm worried about them next week because we're already in an economic crisis and I don't really think they're going to help us out that much. And they're possibly going to make things even worse, which, mind you, part of the reason that we just Trump even got back in there was because Americans are upset with the economy, and rightfully so. But I don't think tariffs are going to be the answer because historically they backfire massively. And this is what happens in 1930. After the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act is passed, France and Canada end up retaliating along with other major trading partners around the world, and this ends up making the depression even worse, not just in the United States but around the world. By the mid 1930, after the passage of the Tariff Act, the unemployment rate in the country hit 11.9%, over almost 12%, over 10% of the United States population is unemployed at the end of by mid 1930. Bank failures later in 1930 would cause a larger economic collapse the following year in 1931. Now, Hoover would also, as the banks are collapsing and the US currency is becoming worth less and less, he's refusing to abandon the gold standard, which the United States has held for years, even though other countries around the world, in order to save their economies, are already starting to abandon it. In Europe, the deteriorating economy, because mind you, the Great Depression, we talk about it from an American standpoint, but it affected the world. The US was the world's largest economy in the 1920s, and thus, when the US economy collapsed, so does the rest of the world. That also depends on the American economy, just like it would very much like today. And this leads to the Great Depression going to from just a regional thing to it hits worldwide. And in Europe, the deteriorating economies in many nations will end up leading to democratic governments even falling apart and collapsing. Most notably, that in the Weimar Germany, which allows a certain dictator named Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party to gain political power in 1933 and come into power, which will lead us to a big old war about 10 years down the road from here, which we know what that one is. So Hitler and the Nazis in Germany are a consequence of the Great Depression because the economic conditions in Germany, which were already bad off before, because we know the post-war economic troubles in 1920s Germany from the First World War, is extremely amplified by the Great Depression, and it's so drastic that the people in Germany are willing to elect someone like Hitler to try to solve their problems. Now, the unemployment rate would hit 15% in 1931, which would go even higher than what Hoover had thought. And this would also cause further bank failures, further layoffs, further for just it just is a chain reaction. The Democrats would end up betraying Hoover by 1931. They're starting to portray him as a very uncaring politician, and many relief programs were launched by Democratic governors such as FDR of New York, which aimed to help the unemployed, which kind of set them apart drastically from Hoover. Hoover is still, at this point in 1931, rejecting any possibility that federal aid is needed. He thinks that the economy is just going to magically right itself. Normally, I would say that that can happen, but in the situation that he was facing, the government needed to intervene, and that is the biggest problem with Hoover's presidency, and that it remains the biggest problem with some ideologies today, is I understand the want of not wanting to have the government basically help its citizens every time there's a little tiny crisis. I understand that, and that I do agree with that. The government does not need to give a bailout every time there's some kind of a minor little crisis that goes on. But what Hoover and I think some people even today fail to realize is that some crises with the economy are so great and so severe that there are times when it's not just going to right itself. The government, by necessity, has to get involved. There are times when that happens. The Great Depression was one of those times. Another more recent one would be the Great Recession of 2008. It was so bad off, it was not going to right itself without some sort of intervention. There are times that the government needs to do that. Hoover failed to see that, and look what it got him. It cost him his presidency as a result. And the very much could happen here if something similar happens under the new president, which I hope for his sake and I hope for the country's sake that does not happen, but it's a possibility. and that is something we have to entertain. Now, there were because of Hoover's seemingly uncaring view during the Depression, where he basically said, I'm not, no, this is still going to solve itself. We don't need to get involved. Because of his views, he gets associated with a lot of derogatory things during the Depression, and people give them little nicknames named after Hoover. Some of the epithets that they end up developing are things like Hoovervilles, which are shanty towns and homeless encampments that get named after him. Hoover leather, which is cardboard, which is being used to cover the holes in that would develop in the soles of shoes, and Hoover blankets, which is just an old newspaper that you use to try to cover up and keep yourself warm. As the unemployment rate would reach 23% in 1932, Hoover finally began to heed calls for direct federal intervention very reluctantly, and I think the only reason he did at this point was it's an election year. He's looking to get reelected. He would establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in order to try to provide government loans to banks, railroads, and local governments. He would also, however, it would fail to stimulate commercial lending to the degree that Hoover had hoped it would, and and ultimately it would make it not exactly the success that he thought. However, it did help some smaller businesses from going under, so it did do some good, just not enough that was needed. He would also enable the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which would establish 12 banks overseen by the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which would be run in a manner very similar to the Federal Reserve. The Glass-Steagall Act would also expand banking credit by expanding the amount that Federal Reserve banks could lend. And then possibly the most important, the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, which would allocate $2 billion for public works to put people to work. And this was one of the few things that Hoover did that was probably a very good thing because it ended up actually getting expanded under FDR. He actually ended up keeping that bill and expanding upon it. So it was something that actually must have been good, or else it probably wouldn't have been kept. In June of 1932, 17,000 World War I veterans ended up gathering in Washington, D.C., calling for the immediate payment of bonuses which had been given to them, had been granted to eventually be paid to them for their service in the First World War. However, the bill that had granted these bonuses said that these bonuses would not be payable to these veterans until 1945. Well, because of the dire economic straits, many of these veterans are saying, "I want my bonus now. I need it now in order to survive." Instead of, trying to negotiate with this group of protesters, Hoover ends up sending the regular army in to break up the encampment, which ends up actually firing shots and ends up killing two protesters during this bonus army march, which did not put him in a very good light leading into the 1932 reelection. By the time the 1932 reelection comes in, Hoover is not in the best of public opinions. The public is absolutely outraged with his performance. They blame him for a lot of the troubles that they were enduring because of his seemingly, uncaring, inactive manner. And Democratic opponent Franklin Delano Roosevelt is actively basically portraying Hoover as such because Hoover and his not Hoover, but Roosevelt in his state of New York had actually passed relief programs as governor to try to help the unemployed. And the Democrats are very successful in 1932 in portraying Hoover and the Republican Party as absolutely being the cause of the Great Depression. And because of that, Hoover's reelection bid in 1932 goes down in absolute flames. It does not even get close. Roosevelt wins that election in a landslide in 1932, which leads to Hoover leaving office on March 4th of 1933, an absolute disgrace. So before we go into the post presidency here, which isn't long, we'll go through some of the images that I have here. So here's a picture of Hoover in the Oval Office during his presidency. Of course, due to the dire economic conditions of the country, that might be a reason why he's not looking the most thrilled. I believe at one point, one of the stories that actually come out of the Hoover White House was he had asked his vice president, Charles Curtis, "Can I have a quarter to call a friend, call up some friends after, as the depression's getting worse?" And Curtis said, "No, here's a dime, call them all," realizing that Hoover probably didn't have that many friends left at all. And here we have a picture of Hoover and his wife Lou Hoover, during their time in office. And here are two Great Depression photos that we have here. So here is the crowd that assembles on the outside of Wall Street after the stock market crash in October of 1929, after Black Tuesday has happened. This is the crowd that starts assembling outside as that bubble has finally burst. And then here we have a picture of something that became a very common sight in a lot of urban cities in the United States during the 1920s and even in other countries around the world. This is a soup kitchen in Chicago in 1931 for the unemployed. And look at the line out the door of people that are unemployed, don't have any means to buy food for themselves, and they're going to a free soup kitchen. And this was around the world as well. And this particular soup kitchen was actually one that was actually set up by Al Capone, the notorious gangster. So Hoover, as we said, he loses re-election. He's a one-term president, and FDR comes in, and as we know, and we'll cover much more in depth next month with however long that video ends up being with him, we'll end up covering, the New Deal. But Hoover does react quite differently than other former presidents, where most former presidents, once they leave office, they're very quiet when it comes to their successors. They don't want to try to openly criticize them publicly. Hoover is an exception. Hoover actually blatantly criticizes FDR's New Deal policies, and he ends up writing many books and articles after he leaves office about the dangers of investing too much power in the federal government. He is absolutely opposed to the Roosevelt administration and what it's trying to do to solve the problem. But mind you, in the long run, while FDR's policies did not entirely solve the Great Depression, World War II would do that, it did get to the United States to a much better point than it had been with Hoover. I wouldn't say the New Deal was a complete success, and we'll discuss that next month. In the 1950s, Hoover would end up returning to public service, helping in humanitarian efforts post World War II in Europe. He would end up serving on the government efficiency commissions that were set up under Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, and this would be a trend that he would continue almost up until his death, where Hoover would end up passing away at the age of 90, one of our longer lived presidents, in New York City on October 20th of 1964. And here we have a picture of Hoover with his son Alan and his grandson Andrew, who was Alan's son, in 1950. And then for our last picture, we have a picture here just about 3 years before Hoover ended up passing away. This is 1961, and this is him with President Kennedy in the White House. So that kind of wraps up for President Hoover. As I said, not one of our better presidents, mostly due to his inactivity. Now, his humanitarian work was great, but he's just not a great president. I'm not saying he wasn't great outside the White House. But Hoover, to this day, I think a lot of the Great Depression, I think he can get a solid amount of the blame for how long it lasted because of his relatively inactivity to want to actually intervene. He did want to admit the fundamental truth that there are times that the federal government needs to get involved in order to help the economy when it goes under. And that's something that like I said, even there's still some people today that still are in that weird sort of thinking. And if you continue in that thinking, you're inviting another crisis like this to happen. And Hoover, the legacy of Hoover is not very good. I mean, obviously, like I mentioned, even President Trump right now has said something of the degree just for the past year, I don't want to be a Herbert Hoover because even he realizes how bad he was. And that was even my family has stories of that. I can very plainly recall my grandmother telling me that there were people in her family growing up that would literally say, don't vote Republican because Hoover was a Republican. They had grown up, they had lived through the Depression era, they remembered Hoover, and they literally, this was just something that stuck with them. Hoover had been such a bad president and they had suffered so much through the depression. They didn't want to go through that again. So in the future, it's almost like I think politically scarred them that they did not want under any condition did not want to even entertain voting for a Republican because of what Hoover had done. And that scarred them politically, I think, for a long time afterward. But that wraps up on Herbert Hoover. And so that wraps up for the month of February as well. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything you'd like to add, anything you'd like to say or anything like that, or any suggestions for any future video content in terms of like topics or anything, feel free to put that in the comment section and I'll be more than happy to go through them. As I said, I do have a couple of ideas for next month moving forward, but we'll see what order they go first. I'm still working out what order. So we'll see how that gets, but we do have some topics on hand, but we always welcome any input for any topics that people actually, have right on their mind. So anything like that, we feel free to put it in the comment section, and hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week. And we'll see you all back here next week for the next video.